How long can a lie survive when the one person protecting it finally decides to tell the truth? For 13 years, my ex-husband, Ethan Bennett, made sure everyone believed I was the villain of our story. He told our friends I had destroyed our marriage. He told our neighbors I had betrayed his trust. He even convinced our daughter that I was the reason our family fell apart. And the worst part? I let him. I stayed silent while my reputation crumbled. I stayed silent while people I once loved turned their backs on me. I stayed silent while Ethan built a picture-perfect life on top of a lie so carefully crafted that nobody ever thought to question it. Not until the night everything changed. It was supposed to be another celebration of Ethan's success. Another room full of smiling faces. Another opportunity for him to remind everyone how far he had come since divorcing the woman he blamed for everything. The ballroom sparkled with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. Laughter echoed through the crowd. Glasses clinked. Cameras flashed. And standing in the center of it all was Ethan, looking exactly like the man everyone admired. Confident, respected, untouchable. Then he saw me. The smile on his face tightened. The room seemed to pause. Because despite everything he had done to humiliate me, despite every rumor he had spread, despite every year he had spent trying to erase me from his story, I had shown up. What Ethan didn't know was that someone else had shown up too. Someone who had carried a secret for more than a decade. Someone who had watched the damage grow year after year. Someone who could no longer live with the guilt of staying quiet. Across the ballroom, a trembling hand gripped an envelope. Inside were pages that could destroy everything Ethan had spent 13 years protecting. Pages that revealed who had really sacrificed everything. Pages that proved the woman everyone blamed had never been the villain at all. As Ethan raised his glass and prepared to tell the crowd yet another version of the story he wanted them to believe, a voice suddenly interrupted him. A voice he never expected to challenge him. A voice that knew the truth from the very beginning. And in that moment, before hundreds of stunned guests, the lie that had controlled my life for 13 years began to crack. Because some secrets stay buried forever, and some wait for exactly the right moment to change everything. I wish I could tell you that Ethan and I started out as one of those couples everyone secretly envied. The truth was more complicated than that. When we first met, neither of us had much. We were both in our 20s, working long hours, dreaming about a future that seemed just out of reach. Ethan was ambitious from the beginning. He could walk into a room and make people believe anything was possible. That confidence attracted people. It attracted me too. Back then, I thought his determination was inspiring. I did not realize that one day it would become more important to him than the people who loved him. We got married in a small church outside Columbus, Ohio. It was a simple ceremony with folding chairs, homemade decorations, and family members who could barely afford the gas money to attend. Looking back, it was one of the happiest days of my life. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything felt real. We were building something together. At least that was what I believed. During the first few years, we worked as a team. I took extra shifts when money was tight. I stayed up late helping Ethan prepare presentations. I listened to every idea, every plan, every dream. When he launched his consulting business, I was the first person who believed it could succeed. There were nights when he wanted to quit. Nights when clients backed out and bills piled up on the kitchen counter. I was always there reminding him why he started. Little by little, the business grew. Then it grew faster. New clients arrived. Bigger contracts followed. The apartment became a house. The used sedan became a luxury SUV. Vacations turned into trips that looked impressive in photographs. From the outside, we looked successful. But success has a way of changing people when they start believing they earned it alone. The first signs were small. Ethan would interrupt me when we were with friends. If I shared an opinion, he would laugh and correct me. If someone complimented me, he would immediately redirect the conversation back to himself. At first I brushed it off. Everyone has flaws. Every marriage has difficult seasons. That was what I told myself. Then the comments became more frequent. He started criticizing how I dressed. He said I looked too ordinary for the social circles he was entering. He suggested I take classes, change my hairstyle, speak differently. He framed everything as helpful advice. But advice is supposed to lift someone up. This felt different. It felt like he was slowly teaching me that I was not enough. When our daughter Sophie was born, I thought things would improve. For a while they did. Ethan adored her. He carried her around the house and talked about all the opportunities she would have someday. Watching him hold her tiny hand made me believe the man I married was still there. But as the years passed, the distance returned. His business became larger. His schedule became fuller. His patience became shorter. He was home less often. Even when he sat across from us at dinner, it felt like part of him was somewhere else. Sophie noticed it too. Children always do. One evening when she was 8 years old, she asked why Daddy looked angry all the time. Ethan laughed when he heard her say it. I laughed too. But deep down, neither of us thought it was funny. The truth was that Ethan had begun measuring people by what they could do for him. If someone could help him advance, he gave them attention. If they could not, they slowly disappeared from his priorities. Unfortunately, I had become one of those people. The woman who once stood beside him as an equal was becoming an inconvenience. At social events, he introduced me less often. When people asked about his success, he answered as though he had built everything entirely on his own. Sometimes I would stand just a few feet away while he told stories that erased my role completely. It hurt, but not as much as what came next. Because eventually, Ethan stopped treating me like a partner and started treating me like a problem. And once that happened, the foundation of our marriage began to crack in ways neither of us could ignore. The breaking point came so gradually that I could not identify a single moment when everything changed. Instead, it felt like watching a crack spread across a windshield. At first it was barely visible. Then one day it stretched from one side to the other. Ethan no longer hid his disappointment when he looked at me. If I suggested a family weekend, he complained about wasted time. If I asked him to attend one of Sophie's school events, he acted as though I was asking him to sacrifice something important. The excuses were always reasonable on the surface. There was always another meeting, another client dinner, another opportunity that could not be missed. Yet somehow there was never enough time left for us. The more successful he became, the more he surrounded himself with people who reinforced his view of the world. Executives, investors, influential friends. Their conversations revolved around status, growth, and image. I noticed something else too. Most of them had spouses who looked and behaved exactly the way Ethan now seemed to expect. They dressed differently. They spoke differently. They knew how to navigate the social circles that came with wealth and influence. Slowly, I began feeling like a guest in my own life. One night, after returning from a charity gala in Cincinnati, Ethan loosened his tie and stared out the kitchen window for several seconds before speaking. His voice was calm, almost casual. That somehow made it hurt more. He said that I no longer fit the life he was building. I remember standing frozen beside the sink. For a moment I thought I had misunderstood him. Then he repeated it. He said I lacked ambition. He said I did not understand his world anymore. He said he felt held back. The strange thing was that none of those accusations reflected reality. I had spent years helping him build everything he now enjoyed. I had sacrificed opportunities of my own so he could pursue his goals. But by then, Ethan had rewritten our history inside his own mind. In his version of the story, he was the hero who had succeeded despite everyone around him, including me. The arguments became more frequent after that. Not explosive arguments. Quiet ones. The kind that leave deeper scars because they are delivered with cold certainty. He criticized my decisions. He questioned my judgment. He dismissed my opinions before I finished speaking. Eventually, I stopped sharing as much. Not because I agreed with him, but because I was exhausted. Around that time, Sophie entered middle school. She was smart, observant, and sensitive. She could feel the tension even when we tried to hide it. One afternoon, she asked whether everything was okay between her parents. I smiled and told her it was. The lie tasted bitter. Deep down, I already knew our marriage was slipping away. Then came the divorce conversation. Ethan approached it the same way he approached business negotiations. Organized, prepared, emotionally detached. He talked about efficiency. He talked about moving forward. He talked about what would be best for everyone. But what I heard was something much simpler. He had already left long before he announced it. The paperwork moved quickly. The marriage that had taken more than a decade to build was dismantled in a matter of months. Friends we had known for years suddenly became distant. Some stopped calling altogether. Others chose sides without asking questions. Ethan was charismatic, successful, and persuasive. People naturally believed his version of events. Why would they not? He seemed confident. I seemed heartbroken. Confidence often wins in the court of public opinion. The hardest part was watching the narrative spread. According to the rumors, I had been unsupportive. According to the rumors, I had created endless conflict. According to the rumors, Ethan had done everything possible to save the marriage. None of it was true. Yet once enough people repeat a story, truth begins to feel irrelevant. I wanted to defend myself. More than once, I opened my phone and started typing messages explaining what had really happened. Every time I stopped, there was a reason I could not fight back. A reason nobody knew. A reason I had protected for years. Even if it cost me everything. Then, 6 months after the divorce was finalized, something happened that made me realize the damage was spreading far beyond my own reputation. Sophie came home from a weekend with her father unusually quiet. During dinner, she pushed food around her plate without eating. Finally, she looked up and asked a question that shattered my heart. She asked if it was true that I had destroyed our family. In that moment, I realized Ethan was not just rewriting our marriage anymore. He was rewriting me. And for the first time, I began wondering how much longer I could keep protecting a secret that was destroying my life. 4 days after Sophie asked that question, her words followed me everywhere. They echoed through the quiet rooms of my house. They surfaced while I folded laundry, while I drove to work, while I stared at the ceiling long after midnight. Is it true that you destroyed our family? I could survive strangers believing the worst about me. I could survive losing friends. I could even survive being treated like the villain in a story I did not write. But watching my own daughter question who I was felt different. That pain settled somewhere deeper. Sophie never said anything cruel after that conversation. In fact, she seemed almost guilty for asking. Yet I noticed subtle changes. She became more reserved around me. Sometimes she hesitated before sharing details about her weekends with Ethan. Other times she seemed caught between two realities, unsure which version of her parents she was supposed to believe. I could not blame her. She was only 12 years old. Children trust the adults they depend on. And Ethan had spent years carefully shaping the narrative. One Thursday afternoon, about 3 weeks after that conversation, I came home to find an envelope in my mailbox. At first I assumed it was another bill or advertisement. The envelope was plain white with no return address. My name was typed neatly across the front. Something about it felt unusual. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For nearly an hour I ignored it. Then curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single folded letter. The paper looked old. Not ancient, but older than something recently printed. My hands grew cold as I unfolded it. The first thing I noticed was the date. 13 years earlier. My stomach tightened immediately. That year sat at the center of everything I had spent so long trying to forget. The letter itself was brief. It did not explain much. In fact, it raised more questions than answers. There was no signature. No explanation of who sent it. Only a few carefully written sentences. The final line hit me hardest. It read, "You protected the wrong person for too long." I stared at those words for several minutes. My pulse raced. 13 years. The same number that kept appearing in my mind. The same amount of time I had spent carrying a burden that nobody else understood. For the first time in years, fear and hope arrived together. Someone knew. Not just part of the truth. Enough of the truth to understand why I had remained silent. That realization terrified me. It also awakened something I had buried long ago. Questions. Who sent the letter? Why now? And what exactly did they know? That night, I barely slept. I kept rereading the note, searching for clues hidden between the lines. The next morning, I noticed something else tucked inside the envelope. It was so small I had missed it initially. A tiny slip of paper containing a location and a time. Saturday, 11 o'clock in the morning. No additional explanation. Common sense told me not to go. Every warning instinct I possessed told me to throw the paper away and move on. Yet by Saturday morning, I found myself driving toward the address. The location turned out to be a small diner outside Dayton, Ohio. The kind of place where regular customers knew the waitresses by name and coffee cups were refilled before they were empty. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a booth near the back. Every time the front door opened, I looked up. Half an hour passed. Then 45 minutes. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been a mistake. Maybe someone was playing a cruel joke. Maybe the letter meant nothing. I was about to leave when a familiar voice spoke behind me. "Claire." My entire body stiffened. Slowly, I turned around. Standing there was Margaret Bennett, Ethan's mother. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Margaret looked older than I remembered. Her silver hair framed a tired face. Yet the expression in her eyes carried something I had never seen before. Regret. She slid into the booth across from me and wrapped both hands around a coffee mug. The silence between us felt heavy. Margaret had never been openly hostile toward me after the divorce, but she had never defended me either. Like everyone else, she had allowed Ethan's version of events to become the accepted truth. Finally, she looked directly at me. Her voice trembled. I was the one who sent the letter. My heart pounded. Before I could respond, she lowered her gaze. Then she said something I never expected to hear. She said she was sorry, truly sorry. I waited for an explanation. Instead, tears filled her eyes. She told me she had spent 13 years convincing herself that staying silent was the right thing to do. She told me she had believed she was protecting her family. She told me that every year the guilt became harder to live with. Then she looked back up and whispered the words that changed everything. The truth is finally catching up to Ethan. And this time, I do not think it can be stopped. Margaret and I remained in that diner for nearly 3 hours. Outside, cars came and went. Families ordered lunch. Waitresses moved between tables carrying plates and coffee pots. To everyone else, it was an ordinary Saturday. For me, it felt like the ground beneath my life was shifting. At first, Margaret struggled to find the right words. Several times she started a sentence and stopped. Several times she wiped tears from her eyes before continuing. I could see the weight she had carried for years. Finally, she took a slow breath and looked directly at me. 13 years earlier, shortly before Sophie was born, Ethan's business had been on the edge of collapse. That part one already knew. What I did not know was how close everything had come to falling apart. According to Margaret, Ethan had made a series of reckless financial decisions. He had borrowed money he could not repay. He had signed agreements he barely understood. If those mistakes had become public, his reputation would have been destroyed before his career ever truly began. I sat silently as she spoke. Pieces of the past began rearranging themselves inside my mind. Certain conversations suddenly made more sense. Certain unexplained absences. Certain moments I had dismissed because I trusted my husband. Margaret continued. When the crisis reached its worst point, Ethan panicked. He believed everything he had worked for was about to disappear. Investors were threatening legal action. Partners were pulling away. The future he envisioned for himself was slipping through his fingers. Then came the decision that changed all of our lives. Margaret reached into her purse and removed a worn folder. The edges were bent from years of handling. Slowly, she placed it on the table between us. I stared at it without touching it. My hands were shaking. Inside were copies of documents I had not seen in over a decade. The moment I recognized them, my chest tightened. Memories flooded back. I remembered the fear, the sleepless nights, the impossible choice standing in front of me. Back then, I had inherited a modest trust from my grandfather. It was not enough to make anyone wealthy, but it represented security. It represented Sophie's future. It represented years of sacrifice by people who loved me. When Ethan's business began collapsing, he begged for help. He promised it would be temporary. He promised he would repay every dollar. Most importantly, he promised nobody would ever know. I remembered sitting across from him at our kitchen table while he explained that everything depended on this one decision. He said employees would lose their jobs. He said families would suffer. He said our future depended on keeping the company alive. I believed him, so I did something very few people knew about. I signed away nearly everything in that trust. The money was transferred quietly. No announcements. No recognition. No credit. The crisis passed. Ethan's company survived. Within a few years, it began growing rapidly. Eventually, it became the foundation of the success he enjoyed today. My eyes drifted back to the documents. I had not looked at them in years because doing so reminded me of a sacrifice that seemed meaningless now. Then Margaret revealed the part one never knew. Several months after the transfer, Ethan had altered the story. Instead of acknowledging what happened, he began telling people that the money had come from his own strategic decisions. As the years passed, he erased my role entirely. Eventually, he stopped mentioning it at all. The room felt strangely quiet as I absorbed her words. Yet none of that explained why she carried so much guilt. Margaret seemed to anticipate my question. She reached deeper into the folder and removed another document. This one was different. It was a signed statement dated 13 years earlier. My breath caught as I read the first few lines. The statement confirmed everything. It detailed the financial crisis. It documented the source of the funds that saved the company. It included signatures from people who had first-hand knowledge of the events. One of those signatures belonged to Margaret herself. She had known the truth all along. She had watched Ethan rewrite history. She had watched him take credit for sacrifices he never made. She had watched him allow me to become the villain while he became the hero. Why now? I finally asked. Why tell me this now? Margaret lowered her eyes. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she explained that Ethan was preparing something big. A public event celebrating the company's latest expansion. Media coverage. Community leaders. Investors. Business partners. Hundreds of guests. During the planning process, he had begun telling the same false story again, presenting himself as the self-made entrepreneur who overcame every obstacle through determination alone. This time, Margaret could not stay silent. The older she became, the harder it was to justify protecting a lie, especially when that lie continued hurting people she loved. Then she revealed one final detail. A former accountant who had worked with Ethan during the crisis still possessed original records. Records that had never been altered. Records that matched everything inside the folder. The accountant had recently agreed to speak if necessary. My pulse quickened. For the first time in years, the truth was no longer just a memory buried in the past. It was becoming evidence. Real evidence. The kind that could withstand scrutiny. The kind that could change everything. As we prepared to leave the diner, Margaret placed her hand over mine. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You protected him for 13 years, Claire. But if you keep protecting him now, you might lose your daughter forever. Those words stayed with me during the entire drive home. Because deep down, I knew she was right. And for the first time since the divorce, I began considering something I had never seriously allowed myself to imagine. What if the truth finally deserved a chance to be heard? The following 2 weeks felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing one step would change everything forever. Every day, I carried the folder Margaret had given me. Every night, I reread the documents. The facts never changed, but my emotions did. Sometimes I felt angry. Sometimes I felt relieved. Sometimes I felt guilty for even considering exposing the truth. After all, despite everything that had happened, Ethan was still Sophie's father. I never wanted to destroy him. That was what made the situation so painful. People often assume the truth automatically feels liberating. In reality, the truth can feel terrifying when it threatens to reshape the lives of everyone involved. Meanwhile, Ethan continued building momentum toward the company's anniversary gala. Local newspapers covered the event. Community organizations promoted it. Business leaders confirmed their attendance. Everywhere I looked, I saw interviews praising Ethan's leadership and perseverance. The more publicity the event received, the more difficult it became to remain silent. One evening, Sophie sat across from me at the kitchen table working on a school project. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked if I planned to attend the gala. The question caught me off guard. I asked why she wanted to know. She shrugged and said her father would be giving a major speech. Then she hesitated before adding that everyone expected it to be special. There was something in her voice that made me pay attention. She sounded uncertain. Not hostile. Not defensive. Uncertain. For the first time in months, I sensed a crack forming in the narrative she had been taught to believe. Children notice inconsistencies long before adults realize it. They may not understand them completely, but they feel them. I carefully asked whether something was bothering her. Sophie looked down at her notebook. Then she admitted something that surprised me. She said the stories she heard from different people no longer matched. Some relatives spoke about me one way. Her father spoke about me another way. And recently, her grandmother had begun acting strangely whenever the divorce came up. Sophie said it felt like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. My heart ached as I listened. More than anything, I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted to hand her the folder and explain every sacrifice, every lie, every decision that had led us here. But I knew she deserved something better than another emotional argument between parents. She deserved the truth supported by facts. The kind of truth that could survive scrutiny. 3 days later, Margaret arranged a meeting with the former accountant she had mentioned. His name was Richard Coleman. He had worked with Ethan during the most difficult period of the company's early years. We met in a small office building on the outskirts of Dayton. Richard was nearing retirement age. He spoke carefully and chose his words with obvious caution. At first, he seemed reluctant to become involved. Then Margaret placed the folder on his desk. Richard stared at the documents for several seconds before slowly nodding. He opened a locked cabinet and removed another file box. What happened next felt almost unreal. One by one, Richard produced original records that matched the documents Margaret had preserved. Financial statements, transfer confirmations, internal correspondence, meeting summaries. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Ethan's company had survived because of resources that came from me. More importantly, several records showed that senior personnel knew exactly where those funds originated. Richard leaned back in his chair and sighed. Then he said something I will never forget. He said Ethan had not simply accepted help. He had built his entire public origin story around excluding the person who made that help possible. The room fell silent. Hearing those words from an independent witness carried a different weight. It transformed painful memories into verifiable reality. Before we left, Richard agreed to attend the gala if necessary. He did not want revenge. He simply believed facts mattered. As the event approached, I found myself sleeping less and thinking more. Some nights I sat on my back porch long after midnight, staring into the darkness while weighing impossible choices. Was exposing the truth selfish? Was staying silent noble? Or had silence become another form of dishonesty? The answer finally arrived from an unexpected source. 2 days before the gala, Sophie called me while she was staying with Ethan. Her voice sounded unusually emotional. She told me she had overheard a conversation. She would not explain exactly what she heard, only that it left her confused. Then she asked a question that made tears fill my eyes. She asked whether there had ever been things I kept secret to protect someone else. For several seconds I could not speak. Finally, I answered honestly. Yes, sweetheart. Sometimes people keep secrets because they believe they are helping someone they love. Sophie was quiet. Then she whispered something that stayed with me long after the call ended. She said sometimes helping the wrong person hurts everyone else. When the call ended, I sat motionless in my chair, because those words sounded remarkably similar to something Margaret had said. And for the first time, I realized the truth was already finding its way to the people who needed it most. The gala was now less than 48 hours away. Hundreds of guests would be there. Reporters would be there. Investors would be there. Ethan would stand before all of them and tell his story once again. The only question remaining was whether this time the story would finally meet the truth. The night of the gala arrived with cold autumn air and clear skies. By the time I pulled into the hotel parking lot, the building was glowing with golden light. Luxury vehicles lined the entrance. Guests in formal attire moved through the revolving doors while photographers captured every arrival. For a moment I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. 13 years of silence had brought me to this moment. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave. Life would certainly be simpler if I did. Then I thought about Sophie. I thought about every conversation, every rumor, every accusation. Most of all, I thought about the countless times I had chosen someone else's comfort over the truth. That was when I opened the door and stepped out. Inside, the ballroom looked exactly the way I remembered from years ago. Crystal chandeliers reflected light across polished floors. Round tables filled the room. Waiters moved between guests carrying trays of appetizers and sparkling water. Business leaders, community figures, and local media representatives filled nearly every seat. At the center of it all stood Ethan, confident, relaxed, admired, as though the entire evening existed to celebrate him. When he noticed me entering the room, a flicker of surprise crossed his face. It disappeared almost immediately. Ethan recovered quickly, offering the same polished smile he gave everyone else. Yet I knew him well enough to recognize tension hiding beneath it. He had not expected me to attend. I quietly took a seat near the back. A few guests glanced in my direction and whispered to one another. I ignored them. Tonight was not about reputation. It was about truth. The program began with introductions and speeches from company executives. One by one, they praised Ethan's leadership and vision. The audience responded with applause. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Ethan stepped onto the stage. The room erupted with approval. He thanked investors, partners, and employees. He spoke about perseverance. He spoke about overcoming adversity. He spoke about building success through determination and sacrifice. For a while, everything unfolded exactly as expected. Then Ethan reached the part of the speech that made my stomach tighten. He began telling the story of the company's early struggles. The same story he had repeated for years. The same version that portrayed him as the lone architect of his success. Around the room, guests listened attentively. Some nodded in admiration. Others smiled. Then Ethan said something that changed everything. He claimed there had been moments when people closest to him had doubted him. Moments when he had been forced to carry burdens alone because others lacked faith in his vision. Several people glanced toward me. The implication was obvious. Even now, with hundreds of witnesses present, he was still rewriting history. He was still presenting himself as the victim and me as the obstacle. That was when a voice interrupted from the front row. Ethan froze mid-sentence. Every head in the ballroom turned. Slowly, Margaret Bennett rose to her feet. The room fell silent. For a moment, nobody seemed to understand what was happening. Margaret was well known in the community. She had supported Ethan publicly for years. Nobody expected her to challenge him, least of all Ethan himself. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Mom, what are you doing?" he asked. Margaret's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained clear. "I am tired of watching a lie become a legacy." The silence that followed felt almost physical. Ethan tried to laugh it off. He suggested they discuss whatever issue she had later. Margaret shook her head. "No," she said. "Later is the reason we are here today. 13 years of later." Then she turned toward the audience. She explained that portions of the story they had just heard were incomplete. Carefully, she began describing the financial crisis that nearly destroyed the company years earlier. Murmurs spread across the room. Ethan attempted to interrupt, but for the first time in perhaps his entire adult life, nobody seemed interested in hearing his version first. Margaret continued. She described the sacrifices made behind closed doors. She described decisions that had protected the company when it was on the verge of failure. Then she looked directly at me. Tears filled her eyes. "Claire saved the company," she said. "Not Ethan. Not investors. Claire." The ballroom seemed to stop breathing. Reporters lowered their pens. Guests exchanged stunned looks. Ethan stood frozen beneath the stage lights. Before he could respond, another figure rose from a nearby table. Richard Coleman. Calmly, professionally, he introduced himself and confirmed his role during the company's early years. Then he presented documentation, original records, financial statements, verified evidence. Everything matched. Every detail, every date, every transfer. The facts left no room for interpretation. As copies circulated among board members and senior executives, the atmosphere in the room transformed completely. The admiration that had filled the ballroom only minutes earlier gave way to disbelief. Questions emerged from every direction. How could this have remained hidden? Why had nobody known? Why had Ethan never acknowledged it? I watched Ethan search desperately for answers. Yet none seemed to come. Because facts possess a quiet power that stories cannot overcome forever. For years, he had controlled the narrative. Tonight, the narrative collided with evidence. Then came the moment that affected me more than anything else. Sophie stood up. I had not even realized she was crying until then. Her eyes moved from the documents to her father and finally to me. The confusion she had carried for months seemed to dissolve into painful understanding. She was beginning to see the difference between a story and the truth. And nothing Ethan said after that could change what had already been revealed. The ballroom remained quiet long after the documents had been distributed. Conversations that normally would have filled the room were replaced by stunned expressions and whispered questions. For years, Ethan had controlled the narrative. He had decided who was admired, who was blamed, and which version of history people accepted as truth. Now that control was slipping away in real time. I did not feel victorious. Surprisingly, I did not even feel angry. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired of carrying a burden that was never mine to carry alone. Tired of watching a lie grow larger every year. Tired of sacrificing my own voice for someone who had stopped valuing it long ago. Ethan stood motionless near the stage. The confidence that had defined him for so many years seemed replaced by something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Around him, board members quietly reviewed records. Business partners exchanged concerned looks. Reporters compared notes. Nobody was interested in applause anymore. They wanted answers. But the most important person in the room was not a reporter, an executive, or an investor. It was Sophie. She slowly walked away from her table and stopped a few feet from me. Tears streaked her cheeks. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I could see the conflict in her eyes. The disappointment. The confusion. The grief that comes when a child realizes adults are not always who they believe them to be. Then she asked the question I had been waiting to hear for months. Why did you never tell me? The answer was simple, even if it sounded complicated. Because I never wanted you to feel caught between your parents. Sophie stared at me. I explained that every decision I made had been guided by one hope. That she could grow up loving both of us without carrying the weight of our mistakes. I told her I believed protecting her father would protect her too. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she shook her head gently. No, Mom, she whispered. It only protected the lie. Hearing those words hurt. Yet they also brought relief. Because for the first time, Sophie was seeing the situation clearly. Not through rumors. Not through assumptions. Through truth. Then something happened that I never expected. Sophie wrapped her arms around me and began crying. She apologized for doubting me. She apologized for believing things she never should have accepted without question. I held her tightly and told her there was nothing to apologize for. She was a child who trusted the people she loved. That was never something she should feel ashamed of. Across the room, I noticed Margaret watching us. Tears filled her eyes too. For years, she had carried guilt over her silence. Tonight, some of that burden seemed to lift. She gave me a small nod. No words were necessary. We both understood what had changed. The truth had finally been allowed into the room. Eventually, guests began leaving. Conversations continued throughout the hotel lobby and parking lot. News of the revelation spread quickly through business circles and local media. Over the following weeks, many people reached out. Some offered apologies. Some admitted they had believed things they never should have accepted without evidence. Others simply wanted to understand how such an important part of the story had remained hidden for so long. Ethan attempted to repair the damage. In some ways, I genuinely hoped he would. Not because I wanted things to return to the way they were, but because accountability gives people an opportunity to become better than they have been. Whether he chose that path was ultimately his decision. Mine was different. For the first time in 13 years, I stopped living as a guardian of someone else's secret. The weight I carried for so long was finally gone. A few months later, Sophie and I spent a quiet Saturday afternoon walking through a local park. Leaves drifted from the trees around us. Families pushed strollers along the paths. Children laughed in the distance. Nothing about the day was extraordinary, yet it felt more meaningful than any gala, award, or public celebration I had ever attended. Sophie slipped her hand into mine and smiled. A genuine smile, the kind I had not seen in a very long time. In that moment, I realized something important. Justice is not always about watching someone fall. Sometimes it is about finally standing in the light after years spent hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it is about reclaiming your own story. And sometimes the greatest reward is not proving someone else wrong. It is knowing that the people who matter most finally know who you truly are. As we continued walking beneath the autumn sky, I felt something I had not experienced in years. Peace. Not because the past had disappeared. Not because every wound had healed overnight. But because the truth no longer belonged to a secret. It belonged to the future. And for the first time in a very long time, that future felt bright.